Today is the birthday of the great leader Mao Zedong. Last year I wrote a commemorative article on his birthday. This year, I will use this anniversary to tell you about the history of the counterattack of the treaty. 1. Farewell, Stuart. On April 23, 1949, the People's Liberation Army's million-strong army broke through the Yangtze River's natural moat and successfully liberated Nanjing. The Kuomintang regime had actually collapsed. At that time, the U.S. ambassador to China Leighton Stewart unexpectedly did not go south to Guangzhou with the nationalist government, but stayed in Nanjing. Stewart. Source, consent. What does Stewart want to do? Of course, we are preparing to contact the CCP to see if we can make a deal with the CCP. This deal is based on the United States' recognition of New China in exchange for New China's continued implementation of treaties signed by the Kuomintang government. The above is not my imagination. On February 3, 1949, 2 months before the People's Liberation Army occupied Nanjing, U.S. Secretary of State Dean Acheson instructed Leighton Stewart to issue a public statement. It is the responsibility of the United States for the new Chinese government to continue to inherit existing Sino-foreign treaty obligations. Prerequisite for recognition. Therefore, the intention of the United States at that time was basically clear: as long as New China recognized and inherited the foreign treaties signed by the Kuomintang, the United States could recognize New China. This U.S. statement also included a potential threat. If New China does not recognize the foreign treaties signed by the Kuomintang, New China will face a comprehensive blockade or even armed intervention by the entire Western world led by the United States. On the one hand, the United States used both soft and hard tactics, and on the other hand, the Soviet Union also put pressure on us. Long before the Battle of Crossing the Yangtze River, Stalin specifically called Mao Zedong and asked the CCP to strive for recognition from the United States. The two most powerful countries in the world are exerting pressure at the same time. Who can withstand it? Sorry, Mao Zedong resisted. Mao Zedong not only rejected Stewart's olive branch, but also published a famous article, Farewell, Stewart. Source, China.com. Then, the People's Liberation Army swept across the southwest and basically liberated all of China within half a year. During this process, the United States not only refrained from armed intervention, but also maintained an ambiguous silence. Does anyone know what? Here we analyze the history around 1949 from a global perspective. 2. The War of Liberation cannot be delayed. Mao Zedong had a famous saying: the war of resistance against Japan cannot be hastened, and the war of liberation cannot be delayed. This famous saying shows the great leader's genius insight into the international situation. When were the 3 major battles and the Battle of Crossing the River fought? September 1948 to April 1949. What is the international situation during this time? During this time, the First Berlin Crisis broke out in Europe. War almost broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union. Let's take a look at the Berlin Crisis. On June 18, 1948, the United States, Britain, and France promulgated the Decree on Reform of the Monetary System of the United States. On June 21, currency reform was officially implemented in the Western occupied area, and the German mark was issued. This action became the trigger for the First Berlin Crisis. After the Soviet Union learned of the plan, it protested on June 19. The occupation commander Solikovsky issued a message to the German people, which stated that Britain, the United States, and France wanted to break up Germany. On June 22, the Soviet-occupied area also implemented currency reform and issued a new D-mark mark. On June 24, land and water transportation and freight transportation between the Western occupied area and Berlin were completely cut off, leaving only 3 corridors from West Germany to Berlin. At the same time, the more than 300,000 Soviet troops stationed in eastern Germany adopted a strong war posture. The United States, Britain, and other countries responded strongly to this and immediately mobilized troops to Western Germany to prepare for a full-scale war. For a time, the whole of Europe was once again in crisis, and it seemed that World War III was about to break out. This is the Berlin Crisis that shocked the world in history. In the end, a compromise was reached through negotiations as neither side was willing to resort to force. On May 12, 1949, the Soviet Union announced the lifting of the blockade of Berlin, ending the Berlin Crisis that lasted for 462 days. The timeline of the Berlin Crisis is from June 1948 to May 1949. 3 months after the Berlin Crisis broke out, The Liaoshen campaign broke out on September 12, 1948, the Huihei campaign ended on January 10, 1949, and the Pingjin campaign ended on January 13. The Cross River campaign was launched in April 1949. Battle of Crossing the River. Source, Sohu.com. Why do the two timelines overlap? Do you think this is just a coincidence? No. This is no coincidence. This is why the War of Liberation cannot be delayed. Mao Zedong's control of the international situation was very precise. Not only that, he was also the best at using the time window of the international situation to make the boldest decisions. The Cuban Missile Crisis broke out between the United States and the Soviet Union from October 15 to November 20, 1962. On October 20, 1962, we launched a counterattack against India. On November 21, the General Staff issued a special telegram to the frontline troops, and then we stopped fighting and voluntarily withdrew. Is this also a coincidence? Therefore, in April 1949, Mao Zedong was quite confident in resolutely rejecting the olive branch of the Yankees despite the pressure from the two major powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. 3. Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States. Let's talk about the focus of this article, why in 1949 we preferred not to have international recognition from the United States, but we must abrogate the treaties signed by the Kuomintang regime. What is this treaty? This treaty is the Sino-US Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation signed between the Kuomintang government and the United States in 1946. This is the treaty that the Yankees value most. Source, Sohu Encyclopedia. Note, of course, the Kuomintang government signed far more than this treaty with the United States. There were also dozens of others including the China-US Aviation Agreement, the China-US Relief Agreement, the Chengdu-Chongqing Railway Construction Agreement, the Qingdao Naval Base Secret Agreement, etc. treaty, but the most important and critical one is the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States. So, what are the specific contents of this treaty? Why do the Americans attach so much importance to this treaty and even use it as a condition for recognizing New China? Is it land cession and compensation? Or self-sovereignty? Neither. On the surface, this is a completely equal and friendly treaty. The main contents of this treaty include that nationals of both China and the United States have the right to live, travel and engage in various occupations such as commerce, industry, culture, and education, religion, etc. within the territory of the other country, as well as the right to mine and develop mineral resources, lease and retain land rights, and enjoy national treatment economically. Goods from both sides enjoy equal tax rates. Warships of both sides can sail freely within each other's ports and territorial waters. In the literal sense of the treaty, the rights and interests of China and the United States are completely equal. Simply put, this treaty means that both China and the United States will open the door and allow the other party's personnel, capital, and goods to enter and exit freely without setting up any obstacles. For such a seemingly equal treaty, the attitudes of China and the United States in 1949 were completely different. The Yankees wanted the new Chinese government to continue it, while the new China firmly opposed it. Why? Because the national power of China and the United States was completely unequal at that time. To be precise, the industrialization capabilities of China and the United States were completely unequal at that time. In 1949, the United States ranked first in the world in terms of industrial output, while China was still an agricultural country at that time. The huge gap between the two sides can be explained by an indicator of steel production. In 1949, the steel production of the United States was 40 million tons, but what about China? Less than 400,000 tons. Because of the huge industrialization capacity, if both sides open the door to free friendly trade and navigation, there will be only one result: the United States' unilateral plunder of China. Now let us take a look at what happened after the signing of the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States. On March 4, 1946, Nanjing officially opened the foreign exchange market and set the foreign exchange rate of legal currency at $1 to 2020 legal currency. The central bank was ordered to buy and sell foreign exchange without restrictions. This was the implementation of a financial liberalization policy. On November 4, 1946, the Kuomintang government signed the Sino-US Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation with the United States. Then, a large number of American goods poured into China, from gasoline to cars, from electric lights to movies, from flour cloth to cotton yarn and sugar, from lipstick and stockings to ties and leather shoes, even nails and cigarettes are all made in the United States. Domestic private enterprises can hardly survive and have closed down one after another. When everyone starts to use American products, do you know what this concept is? American goods must be exchanged for the country's foreign exchange. The prevalence of American goods is equivalent to the fact that the common people are using the Kuomintang government's foreign exchange reserves for food and clothing. One side is spending wildly on foreign exchange, while the other side's foreign exchange income has basically stagnated. The reason is very simple. As soon as the policy to stimulate import trade was implemented, exports came to a complete halt due to overvaluation of the exchange rate and insufficient cost. Foreign exchange could not flow in, the balance of payments deteriorated sharply, and foreign exchange reserves gradually dried up. In 1946, foreign trade imports a huge increase to $474.3 million US. Well, nearly $500 million in foreign exchange reserves are gone. Seeing this situation, the Kuomintang authorities panicked again, and finally promulgated the method of export subsidies and import levies on February 5, 1947. That is, starting from February 16, when exporting goods are settled in foreign exchange, a 100% subsidy will be provided on the export price. For imported goods, a 5% surtax will be levied based on the customs tax price. However, in order to please the United States, large-scale U.S. exports to China such as machinery, cotton, rice, wheat, and kerosene are exempted from additional taxes. Are you thinking of protecting independent industries now? Late. Even if he compromises like this, the American masters still won't agree. As soon as the Export Encouragement Act was promulgated, the U.S. consulate in Shanghai immediately notified the KMT government's shipping companies in writing, clearly stating that the KMT government's export subsidy measures conflicted with the U.S. Tariff Act of 1930 and the U.S. customs tariffs. Therefore, those who received KMT government subsidies with the goods will be specially taxed after they arrive in the United States. In other words, how much your national government subsidizes exported goods will be how much the U.S. government will impose additional taxes. At that time, China's import and export trade was completely monopolized by the United States. The United States strongly opposed it, and Song Zaiwen's decree to encourage exports came to an end. Exports could not open up the situation, but imports were still uncontrollable. Although the Kuomintang government sold a large number of Japanese and puppet assets to balance the balance of payments, by March 1947, the Kuomintang government's foreign exchange reserves had decreased by $453.72 million US. After the victory of the anti-Japanese war, the Kuomintang government had approximately $850 million US in foreign exchange reserves. As a result, it lost more than $500 million US a year. If the proceeds from the sale of Japanese and puppet assets and materials are included, the actual expenditure will reach $700 to $800 million US. You must know that in 1946, the Kuomintang government's military expenditure for the Civil War was only more than $100 million US a year. Foreign exchange reserves have plummeted, and the Kuomintang government can only turn on the money printing press to maintain government spending. In August 1945, the issuance of legal tender was only 556.9 billion yuan. By February 1947, the issuance of legal tender had reached 4,837.8 billion yuan, and the overissuance of currency had exceeded 8 times. The overissuance of currency will naturally lead to skyrocketing prices. During the arduous period of the 8-year anti-Japanese war, the price index in the Kuomintang-controlled areas only exceeded 22.5% of the currency issuance multiple. However, 1 year after the war, the price index exceeded the currency issuance multiple by 111.5%, and this gap is still widening. Hyperinflation can no longer be suppressed. In September 1945, 100 French currency could buy 2 chickens. In January 1946, it could only buy 2 eggs. In March, it could only buy 2 briquettes. Before the Civil War broke out, French currency had already begun to depreciate at an alarming rate. According to the economy of the Republic of China in the bitter rain, the purchasing power of 100 yuan of French currency in different eras is as follows. In 1937 you could buy 2 cows. In 1941, one could buy a pig. In 1945 you could buy a fish. In 1946, you could buy an egg. In 1947, you could buy 1/5 of a fried dough stick. In 1948, you could buy 2 grains of rice. In 1949, 1 grain of rice could be purchased for 2.45 thousandths. Note, in 1946, the economy of the Kuomintang-controlled areas collapsed rapidly. In addition to the United States relying on the Sino-US Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation to unilaterally plunder China, there was also the reason why Song Zaiwen, the then president of the Executive Yuan of the Kuomintang government, repeatedly made misguided economic policies. Now everyone understands why the Chinese Communist Party headed by Mao Zedong resolutely abolished the Sino-US Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation, even if it has to pay the price of being completely blocked by the Western world led by the United States. Comrade Mao Zedong declared that the Chinese people have stood up. This represents a kind of fearless determination and courage. We are going to abolish the special interests of the great powers in China, and we are not going to let you continue to dominate the Chinese nation. Blood-sucking, even if you block and suppress us, we must be self-reliant and tighten our belts to stand up. For 70 years in a blink of an eye. If we look at the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States now, we will find a shocking phenomenon. The same treaty, without changing a single word. I think China should be very willing to sign this treaty with the United States now, but the United States should be very reluctant. Why? Because our industrial capabilities are very strong today. China's total industrial output value in 2018 equals the sum of the United States plus Germany plus Japan. Schematic diagram of the world's largest commodity suppliers in 2000 and 2019. Data source, FT, Pictet Asset Allocation Macro Research, IMF Direction of Trade Statistics. You see, this is the essential reason why China firmly supports globalization while the United States engages in trade protectionism. Now let me imagine what would happen if China and the United States signed the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States again. If both China and the United States grant each other national treatment and do not impose any obstacles on the other party's personnel, capital, and goods. U.S. exports to China. Exports of U.S. high-tech products remain basically unchanged. The U.S. trade in services and cultural products with China will increase, but the increase will not be large, because China currently does not impose many restrictions on these 2 types of U.S. goods. U.S. agricultural exports will increase significantly. Among them, soybeans and meat products themselves are what we need to import, and there is no harm in this. One problem is that the export of grains such as wheat and rice from the United States may impact our staple food market, but there is no way to solve it. For example, the country comes forward to purchase American staple grains as our grain reserves. This may cost 20 to 30 billion US dollars. US shale oil exports will increase, which we ourselves need to import. As for US shale gas, which is relatively expensive, we have complete control over how much to import. The other is financial openness. We can definitely grant national treatment to US capital, because this is what we are currently doing. Starting next year, we will further expand financial opening and completely remove restrictions on foreign capital entering the financial field. Of course, US capital can also participate in China's mineral development. China's most abundant mineral resources are coal mines, which currently have excess production capacity. We very much welcome US capital to acquire coal mines that have been closed down and transferred to China. China's most valuable minerals are rare earths, but China's strongest asset is not its rare earth reserves. Many countries around the world have abundant rare earth reserves, but its rare earth processing industry chain. Therefore, US-funded participation in rare earth development can only be processed in China and then exported. Taking stock in this way, overall the US gains are very limited. The increase in exports to China is estimated to not exceed 100 billion US dollars. Here's a look at what China can get. If China and the United States sign the Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation between China and the United States, then the scene in China in 1946 will basically reappear in the United States. A large number of Chinese goods are flooding into the United States. In 2017, the United States exports to China were 130 billion US dollars, and China's exports to the United States were 550 billion US dollars. If the United States completely opens its doors to Chinese commodities, this number will increase significantly. Southeast Asian textile exports to the US were crushed by China. We got lower tariffs. Huawei's mobile phones, CRRC's motorcycles, DJI's drones, etc. are sweeping the US market. 4G and 5G construction in the United States are dominated by Chinese investment. The US security market is being dominated by Hikvision. China's photovoltaic industry has fully engulfed the US market. US steel companies will be driven to the ground by Chinese steel capital. The US construction market and infrastructure construction are monopolized by Chinese capital. Because Chinese capital is given complete national treatment, there are no restrictions on Chinese capital's acquisition of American high-tech technology. So, let the Wassenaar Agreement go to hell. By the way, China can also legitimately participate in the development of shale oil and shale gas in the United States. All these pictures are so beautiful that I can't even imagine them. Therefore, the United States today is absolutely unwilling to sign the Sino-US Treaty of Friendship, Commerce, and Navigation with China. Hedong in 30 years, Hexi in 30 years. It's still that treaty. Or China and the United States, two countries? The attitudes and intentions of both parties were completely reversed. How can we look back on history and not be filled with emotion? 5. Thanks to the great leader. Thanks to Mao Zedong and the older generation of proletarian revolutionaries. Under the conditions of poverty, he led the Chinese people to adhere to the path of self-reliance, established the most complete industrial system on the planet, and achieved a counterattack in industrial capacity through the efforts of several generations. In 1993, Russian Prime Minister Chernomyrdin and Navy Commander Gromov, accompanied by Ukrainian Prime Minister Kukma, went to the Black Sea shipyard to study the possibility of completing the construction of the Varyag aircraft carrier and handing it over to Russia. 6. This aircraft carrier was originally built with funds from the Soviet government. Ukraine required Russia to pay the full cost, that is, to sell it as a complete warship, not the 30% that Russia believed was unpaid. Factory director Makarov reported at this time, Varyag can no longer be completed. Chernomyrdin asked with a sullen face, in order to complete the warship, what exactly does the factory need? Russia can provide you with everything you need. Makarov replied, we need the Soviet Union, the Party Central Committee, the State Planning Commission, the Military Industry Commission and 9 defense industry ministries, 600 related majors, 8,000 supporting factories and more than 200,000 professional talents. Makarov finally concluded, only a great power can build it, but this power no longer exists. Later, the Varyag aircraft carrier was sold to China, and with China's strong industrial capabilities, it became our first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning. Varyag evolves into Liaoning. Source, Sina. In the past few years, a group of Indian braggarts in China have been claiming that India will surpass China in the future. So, can India surpass China in the future? Able. But the premise is that India needs a Mao Zedong. We need a political party that works hard for our beliefs. A thorough agrarian revolution is needed. It requires the courage to sacrifice 20 million people for the agrarian revolution. If all this is not the case, why should India surpass China? I would like to write this article to commemorate the 126th birthday of Mao Zedong. If the sky does not moisten it, eternity will be like a long night.